Yes, welcome to the fifth of our Thursday evening online Bible classes, looking at the book of the prophet Isaiah. And we've said it's a very long book. This is more of an overview, more of a survey. And indeed, this evening we are going to um, fly through some passages, and some of them we will simply mention with no more than a word or two. But hopefully, we'll get the gist of what's going on, and everything will make some sort of sense. So this is our outline for these 12 weeks, and we find ourselves there down in week 5. We're going to be looking at a section that I've entitled Israel and the Foreign Nations. Actually, before we get there, we're going to catch up from what we missed out last week, which will probably take us half of our time this evening. But fear not, all will be well. Last week, you may remember, we ended the session on something of a cliff edge. I know you've been hanging on to the edge of your seats for the last 7 days. Well, we'll return to there in just a few moments. We looked first of all last time at the vision which the prophet saw, presumably in the latter days of King Uzziah's reign in Jerusalem. It was in the year in which he died. Then we saw something of there we go, we saw something of the threat posed to Judah from the northern alliance of Israel and Syria, that which is often spoken of as the Syro-Ephraimitic alliance. Isaiah made it very clear to King Ahaz of Judah that he had nothing to fear. He simply needed to trust in God for protection. Um, that was it. That's all he needed to do. But of course, that's not what he did do. We then turned our attention to Assyria, to whom King Ahaz had turned for help. He didn't turn to God, he turned to Tiglath-Pileser III, king of Assyria, which was, I really need not say, a awfully stupid thing to do. But, well, some people choose to learn the hard way, and Ahaz certainly chose that option. So, yes, he turned his attention, well, we turned our attention to Assyria. Ahaz had turned to them for help in order to overcome this threat from the north. Well, in time, under another king, Assyria themselves would turn on Judah and virtually annihilate them. But God would not allow them to be destroyed. Isaiah tells us this, and we will read more of that much later in the book. In all of this, the prophet and the children whom God had given to him were to be signs. They were to be living evidence of the words of God to those in his generation. And you may recall last week we briefly met Shear-Jashub. We met Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, two of the sons of the prophet Isaiah. We also were introduced to the imminent arrival of another child called Emmanuel, who may, or then again may not, have been another son of the prophet Isaiah. Well, the prophet was told to preserve his teaching among his disciples, for the people around him sought help and advice from any and everyone except from the Lord their God. So the prophet was to preserve his teachings. We have them now today, so we're awfully thankful that he did that. And as I said earlier, as I reminded us earlier, we did end on a note of gloom there hanging onto the edge of the cliff, just hoping that things were going to get better. You may recall the prophet painted a picture of those who had abandoned the ways of God. They will, he said, roam through the land aimlessly, greatly distressed and hungry, speaking freely and contemptuously against their king and their God. Everywhere they look will be darkness and gloom, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. And so, for the last 7 days, we have, I'm sure, been walking around looking absolutely miserable. But fear not, for good times are going to come. This, of course, is Israel. This is Judah. And before we turn on the lights, okay, I want us just to remind ourselves of the historical context, because, as always, it's going to be terribly important for us to make sense of what's going to be going on within the text. Remember, Isaiah clearly sets his vision within the historical context of the reign of 4 kings of Judah. There they are: Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. There's our timeline. I want you to notice we did last week the name of Ahaz there, one of the kings of Judah. And I want you to notice also towards if you look there at the top right of the that timeline, the expanded timeline on the top of the screen, note when Babylon comes against Jerusalem. Just make a mental note of that in your mind, if you would. And note also I'm going to put up the names of some kings of Assyria, and just so that we can be familiar with them. They will be making an appearance fairly shortly. And there we go. I've abbreviated that first one. That's Tiglath-Pileser III, affectionately known as TP3. Not that there was anything particularly affectionate about him. He was a brutal chap, not the kind of fellow with whom you would want to have Sunday afternoon tea, or any other day of the week for that matter. The next one is a very brief abbreviation of Shalmaneser V. I'm afraid his reign wasn't long enough to get his whole name into there, but there we go. Then we had Sargon II and Sennacherib. Just be aware of those. Be mindful of those Assyrian kings. We will be mentioning them as we go along. So, well, as we've already said, lengthy book. Haven't got time to even read each section as we work our way through the book. So hopefully you've been reading along there in your own time. And what we need to do this evening, first of all, is to finish what we didn't cover last time, and to hopefully get ourselves out of the doom and gloom where we ended. So here's an outline for this evening's session. We're going to be looking at A Child is Born. I've marked with an asterisk those sessions which are essentially finishing off where we were last week. It'll be last orders for Israel, then some judgment on Assyria, the root of Jesse, my strength and my song. Then we're going to be getting into what we really are meant to be looking at this evening, but we're only going to do this really rather briefly. We're going to look at judgment against the nations, general overview, specifically look at some judgment against Babylon, and then various oracles against the nations. So it is another action-packed evening, but probably not going to be going on quite as long as we did last week. Okay, so let's begin with that first section, which we've titled A Child is Born. But he begins in the opening words of chapter 9. This is not the best chapter division, okay? It really does continue from where we were last week. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. I look at this, I always think there's so much we could be saying. Those last phrases there, incidentally, were seemingly three areas into which the Assyrians had divided that part of the land once they had taken it captive, but we'll not concern ourselves with that. What we will concern ourselves with is that these words are directly related to those which immediately preceded it, when the prophet had said, "They'll look to the earth, but behold distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they'll be thrust into thick darkness." And that's why we've been so miserable for these last 7 days. He spoke there of the former time, then he spoke of the latter time. Yes, in the former time, he had brought into contempt the land of Zebulun, Naphtali, but in the latter time, he's made glorious the way of the sea, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali. Those northern tribes would have been the first to experience the might of Assyria when they came against Israel. And from there, one would arise who would bring glory. Of course, the teacher from Galilee himself. I suppose when we think of Galilee, we are almost instinctively inclined to think of the land in which Jesus walked with his disciples. Maybe we have pictures of it as being, I don't know, rolling green hills and this beautiful sea surrounded by these fishing towns and villages and the places to which Jesus traveled in his journeys up north, etc., etc. But in former times, that whole area had been overrun by the Assyrians. It had been overrun with all of their wickedness and their idolatry and all the rest of it. So the prophet here looks forward to the time of Messiah, over 700 years, and something that we really ought to note it. Well, let's read on a little bit and see if you notice it. The prophet continues in verse 2 of chapter 9 by saying that the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation, you've increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. And everybody shouted, "Hurrah!" and words to that effect. You might have heard me say before, because, you might have heard me say before that those opening words were my favorite words of all scripture when I was a young lad back in my prep school days, many, many years ago. They were words that were read. We might have heard them read even over this past Christmas period. They were words that were read at our annual carol service. And I remember after a year or two listening out for them and loving the idea that the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light. And I love that idea. I thought it was absolutely splendid, a beautiful, beautiful thing. But did you notice as we were reading, as we began to read that text, that there is a shift from the past tense, not to the future, but to the present. Isaiah did not say the people who walked in darkness will see a great light, or that those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them will light shine. He doesn't say that. He speaks of the light shining in the present. They have seen a great light. On them has light shone. It is as if the prophet is transported forwards in time 7 centuries and has witnessed these things taking place. This is an aspect of the book of the prophet Isaiah which presents some people with problems. The idea that the prophet is speaking as if he already was in the future. And such was the clarity and such was the certainty of these words that he speaks as if they were already taking place. We'll come back to that idea a little bit later on this evening, perhaps. But the contrast could barely be more evident. Even though in the time of the prophet it was doom and gloom and darkness and misery, that's not the way the story ends as he looks ahead. And then, in terms that are really most specific and also just absolutely glorious, he goes on from here to say that for to us a child is born. Again, notice he doesn't say a child will be born, for to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. I suspect this may be the best known, or at least one of the best known passages from the book of the prophet Isaiah. For to us a child is born, and there can be no doubt, looking back as we now do, that this is clearly messianic. There are one or two out there who want to make this child a child of Hezekiah, but the language is far too grand for anything as that. Of course, the child was a descendant of Hezekiah, a great, you count them all up, grandson, indeed, and he would be sitting upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, as he says. But this is clearly messianic. It's speaking of the coming Messiah, as the prophet does on a good number of other occasions as we go through the book. Well, we could spend a whole evening, we could spend several evenings, I'm sure, looking at the passage. We won't, for time is never on our side. We're going to move forward because, yep, ding ding, it is last orders for Israel. That takes me back, the ringing of the bell, but not this evening. Here we go. This section here, chapter 9, verse 8, chapter 10, verse 4, is clearly directed against the arrogance and the oppression of Israel. For example, here, the people did not turn to him who struck them, that is God, nor inquire of the Lord of hosts. So the Lord cut off from Israel head and tail, palm branch and reed in one day. Well, there we go. These are words against Israel for their arrogance, for not turning to God, but rather turning elsewhere and looking elsewhere for help and protection. The passage will go on to speak of blessing that will come on all through the house of David, but Israel must first of all pay for their rebellion. And moving on again further into chapter 10, we'll read of judgment. Oops, I'm sorry, I meant to put that up. We'll read of judgment upon Assyria. Now, this section here in chapter 10 addresses the judgment that is to come upon Assyria, whom God describes as the rod of his anger. You might notice there, particularly in that opening text, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Remarkable passage. Even though Assyria were God's instrument of justice. That is how he describes them. They are the rod of his anger. They are the tool that he will use in order to enact justice upon his people. Even though Assyria were God's instrument of justice, they too would be punished and would be destroyed for their wickedness. This is a rather important principle, that God will willingly use the wickedness of Assyria in order to accomplish his purpose, but then he will willingly punish them for their wickedness, even though he had used it to accomplish his purpose. That in no way would let them off the hook. A little later in the book, the prophet will say, "Ah, you destroyer, who yourself have not been destroyed, you traitor, whom none has betrayed. When you have ceased to destroy, you will be destroyed. And when you have finished betraying, they will betray you." So we'll learn a little bit of God's justice. We learn a little bit of how it is that God will use others to accomplish his purpose. And then he will bring judgment upon them for their wickedness. But here's the thing that we find in this passage, that in spite of what Assyria might have thought, they were really not the ones in charge. This is a little breakdown of the passage, which I think is useful in order to again understand the way that God is working in all of this. Verses 5 and 6, basically, God says, "I'm using you in order to bring about my judgment." Verses 7 to 11, it's as if Assyria says, "Oh, no, you're not. I'm enjoying this." I mean, they don't actually say that. You understand. They're not having a conversation with God, but that's in essence how they see it. Assyria destroyed the other nations, not because God was using them to do that. They destroyed the other nations because that's what they enjoyed doing. You know, it was their choice. They really believed that they were invincible, that they were in charge. Well, that's the idea of those next verses. Who's God? Who is he? Look what we have done. Yeah, that's what Assyria is saying. And so Assyria are going to be judged. Shall the axe boast over him who hews with it, or the saw magnify itself against him who wields it? Just because Assyria were the rod of God's anger, the weapon in the hands of God, well, that's all they were. They were not in control. They were not in charge. and they will be judged. One day they would learn. So verses 20 to 27, we're told that a remnant of Israel and Judah are assured they will learn to lean upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. We mentioned that phrase, I think, in the beginning on our introduction, one that is almost peculiar here to the prophet Isaiah. They'll learn to lean upon him. They should really not be afraid of the Assyrians, because once God has finished his judgment of Israel, he's going to destroy the Assyrians. And he will, but first of all, Assyria will destroy Israel. And here the prophet describes the main points through which Assyria must pass on its way to Jerusalem, looking at the geographic locations. And well, it is, here's the thing: Assyria will destroy Israel. They will later attempt to destroy Judah, but they will not be allowed to fully destroy the southern kingdom of Judah, because Yahweh, the God of Israel, he is the one in control, and he is the one who will bring about the downfall of Assyria. So we must move on, and we will, into chapter 11 very, very, very briefly. It speaks of yet future blessings under the Messiah of the house of David. There will come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be in the fear. It's a beautiful passage, and I wish that we had time to read through it all and spend the whole evening here. Alas, we do not. But there it is in chapter 11. Read through that, a beautiful passage. Notice the themes of justice and righteousness and faithfulness that would characterize the reign of Messiah. Then there's a beautiful text which is not difficult to picture in your minds. I think we said a while ago how that the prophet Isaiah paints for us so many pictures, albeit in a verbal fashion. But all we need to do is read them and imagine here the wolf the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra. The weaned child should put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And they all lived happily ever after. Well, it doesn't quite end that way, but you get the idea. It is a beautiful picture of absolute peace and harmony within God's creation. Should we take all of this literally? I don't think so, unless if somehow it is speaking of the idyllic state of God's new creation, and new heavens and new earth. But the picture depicts a most idyllic future for the people of God. And such are the blessings under Messiah that would come. Chapter 12 is essentially a song of praise to the one in whom we should all trust. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid, for the Lord God is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. And we could and probably should, but we won't read through the rest of Isaiah. It's really a psalm. And I don't know if anybody has. Somebody needs to set this to music. So if you know of a musical version of Isaiah chapter 12, will you share it with me? Because I've not yet come across one, but it's a beautiful song. And this would be one of those passages that would be just a good thing to read at the beginning of your, Sunday morning assembly, perhaps. It really is a delightful passage. But now we really must move into what we are meant to be looking at this evening, and that is the judgment against the nations. So if you've got any questions, comments, observations up until this point, you can, jot them down or save them till the end and we'll consider those. But what we're going to do now is to take a look at a section. It's a fairly lengthy section from chapter 13 all the way to chapter 23. So that's 11 chapters there. And we're going to look at those in about 20 minutes. Okay, yes, that's it. So fasten your seatbelts just a little bit here. Before we say anything about this next section concerning Israel and the foreign nations, it might be worth saying a few words as to why this section is here. And that might be the most useful thing to do. Why do we have in the middle of a book of the prophet Isaiah, in which he speaks of his vision that he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, why should we have this section that concerns the nations that are foreign to Israel? Well, for the most part, this section does speak against nations foreign to Judah. And in that respect, it's somewhat similar to a section in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. If you're familiar with his book, you'll be familiar with that section. There's some of these oracles or messages here in Isaiah. Some of them are dated, some of them are not, although some of those which are not can be dated through internal evidence, through the content of the messages. But why are they there? What is their purpose? Well, I can see that Lee is on the ball here. For first of all, it's to show that God is not a local deity. That is, his power, his authority is not restricted to the land, to the nation of Israel. He is, as Lee rightly commented, the God of all nations. And I think this is an important lesson for us to be mindful of today also, that he is the God not only of those who walk in Christ, he's the God of everybody, whether or not they recognize him. It makes no difference. He is the God of all. So, secondly, I think another reason why this section is here is to show that God will punish those nations who have oppressed Israel. God cares for his people, and he's going to see that justice is done and that justice is seen to be done. And of course, we must remember this whenever we think of judgment, whenever we think of punishment. If punishment is an expression of love, even towards those who were punished, and that might sometimes take a little while to get our head around, then God must also love the nations too, and he does. If God will not tolerate wickedness in his own people, well, he will not tolerate it in others, for God is ultimately just. And the problem of sin, the problem of rebellion, needs to be addressed. And so when we think of all of this, we're not simply to think of God sitting back and zapping the nations because they have treated his people badly and unjustly and whatever. Because at the end of the day, the oppression and injustice that have been suffered by his people has really been their own doing, due to their own rebellion and their own sinfulness. And God has punished them, he's judged them because he loves them. He loves all people. And we all need to learn that it is doing us no good to live a life of sin, of rebellion. So all of this in one way or another concerns Judah and Jerusalem. It is for their benefit. And if it is for their benefit, then of course it's for the benefit of the world as a whole. So these are the nations, which we could say a lot more of that, and maybe we will at the end if there's any, questions or what have you that we may need to address. But these are the nations which the prophet addresses, and I'm going to list them here, and along with some references. So we have Babylon, we've got Assyria, we've got Philistia, we've got Moab, Syria and Israel, Ethiopia, Egypt and others, Babylon, Edom, Arabia, Judah, Tyre. No, I'm not going to read out all the references, but there they are on the screen for you, that deal with these various judgments, these various oracles or messages of judgment against these various nations. And as you can see, they are of varying lengths. There is a degree of overlap and repetition, and there's generally no obvious order or sequence. It is as if these are messages of judgment against these nations, and they've all been put together in this section of the book. We certainly do not have time to consider each of these. You may want to read through them and maybe note any observations or questions that arise. And you can always bring them to our next class. I'm more than happy for you to do that, or drop me a line if that would be useful. But certainly start off by reading through them. We're going to say something particularly about Babylon. And that is the first oracle. Its place here has certainly raised a good number of questions already. So let's spend a little bit of time looking at the judgment against Babylon. And let's first of all, I tell you what, I was going to do this. I forgot I was going to do this, but I've just remembered. I've mentioned all those places just in case you're not sure where they are. I've got a couple of maps here. If you can see, the one on the right is obviously a much larger scale, and hopefully you can see where it fits in on the one on the left. You can see there the Mediterranean Sea, and you can see where Judah and Israel. Okay, there we go. So let's just indicate where all these places are in the order that we've just mentioned them. We've got Babylonia, then above that we've got Assyria, we've got Philistia. There we go. And I've highlighted it on the other map because it's a bigger scale, but you can find it over there. You can see Gaza and Ashkelon there on the map to the left as well. Okay, that's Philistia. It's the home of the Philistines. We've got Moab, and then Syria and Israel. They're joined together. That's that Syro-Ephraimitic alliance of which we read back in chapter 7. We've got Ethiopia down there, bottom left. We've got Egypt, and then others also. We've got Babylon. There we go. We've already mentioned them. Oh, and then we've got Edom down there, and then there's Arabia, and of course Judah. There we go. And Tyre up there, up in Phoenicia, up there on the north. So that's just a little, you could find them yourselves, couldn't you? But just a notion of the nations all around about. Right, we'll take a few moments to say something about the judgment against Babylon. We'll begin with a very little history. And there is reason for this, okay? So yeah, just follow along if you can. We'll be mentioning a few names, some of which we've already mentioned earlier on this evening, and at least one or two, or maybe three that we didn't, but they will feature, at least some of them in some way or another will feature later on in this book. So it's not a bad idea to become a little more familiar with them. Well, during the time of the, oops, a daisy, I forgot I'd put that in there. Well, I put that in there just so you can be mindful of, I think the only other place I wanted us to be mindful of there was just to the east of Babylonia. You'll see Elam. Okay, well, there we go. Let's get back to the little history. During the time of the prophet Isaiah, Babylonia was subject to Assyrian rule. Okay, so that's an important point for us to bear in mind. Assyria, they are the dominant force. They are the world empire at the time of the prophet Isaiah. Following the death of Shalmaneser V, you remember he was there in the timeline that we looked at earlier, following his death in 722, and that happens at the same time as Assyria are destroying the northern kingdom of Israel. Following the death of Shalmaneser V in 722 BC, Merodach Baladan, interesting chap. We'll certainly come across him a little bit later in the book. He revolted, and one could argue that he was, along with many characters of his day, a pretty revolting chap. He was crowned king in Babylon, claiming the rights of descent from a grandfather who'd made himself king earlier in the century. Well, he maintained the degree of independence of Babylon until 710 BC, when Sargon II, who had succeeded Shalmaneser V of Assyria, he found time to put down the rebellion, expelling Merodach Baladan from Babylon. Okay, when Sargon died, that's Sargon II, although some would say he might have been the third, but that's by the by. When Sargon died in 705 BC, Merodach Baladan reclaimed Babylonian sovereignty and took an active role in stirring up trouble against Assyria elsewhere, including sending an envoy to King Hezekiah of Judah. So watch this space. Yes, we will meet him again a bit later. So the thing to sort of get to grips with here is that Babylonia, the land, the sort of kingdom, but they're really a vassal state of Assyria. They were a constant pain in the proverbial, a constant thorn in the side of Assyria for many, many, many years. Well, in 703, Sargon's son, who succeeded Sargon upon his death, Sargon's son Sennacherib, defeated Merodach Baladan, causing him to flee to Elam, where he later died. Over the next 80 years or so, Assyria continued having to deal with ongoing Babylonian tribal rebellion. They really were a right pain. Well, shortly after the death of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, incidentally, if you're familiar with some of the Assyrian reliefs in the British Museum, you may be familiar with what is a real gem, the Royal Lion Hunt. That dates from the reign of King Ashurbanipal as the last great Assyrian king. Well, shortly after his death, which occurred 627-ish, maybe a little before that, Nabopolassar set himself up as king in Babylon, reigning until 605 BC. During his reign in 612, Nineveh was destroyed with little help from Elam, and Assyria was virtually at an end. That was them essentially finished. Under Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the kingdom of Judah was taken into captivity, remaining in exile until 536 BC. By then, Babylon had fallen to Cyrus the Great, king of Persia. And yes, we'll come across Cyrus a little later in the book of the prophet Isaiah. Well, you're all sitting there terribly well behaved, but asking yourselves the question, why is this relevant? Well, this section from chapter 13, verse 1 through to chapter 14 and verse 23, as we have our Bibles divided, this section portrays Babylon as the supreme world power. Now, at the time of Isaiah, as we've already seen, she was always subject to or rebelling against Assyria, who were the supreme world power at the time of Isaiah. Indeed, this section even looks forward to the downfall of Babylon. So Isaiah pictures Israel as already being in captivity in Babylon, looking forward to their deliverance at least 80 years before they actually went into captivity. And this has posed people with, over the centuries, recent centuries, with a lot of difficulty. This was one of the first sections of the book to be questioned by liberal theologians in the 19th century, AD, of course, due to their denial of the possibility of predictive prophecy. How on earth could a late 8th century BC prophet speak of events that weren't going to take place until the 6th century BC? How could that possibly happen? And so obviously they thought the book must have been written by more than one person, more than one Isaiah. And I know we spoke a little bit about this in our opening introductory session. But chapter 13, verse 1 begins with the words, the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw. So, yes, he was there all along. And just as he had done, as we mentioned earlier, just as he had done before, so now he is speaking as if he was living centuries ahead of his time and speaking of things that were to happen, often in great detail. So a little bit of a run through of this passage here, from after having told us that this was an oracle or a message concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. The next section we read of Yahweh gathering together the nations that he will use to overrun Babylon. Verse 4 says, "The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle." He's gathering his forces together because, of course, it is he who controls the nations. Even though it is they who appear to gain the victory, God is in control. This is a terribly important concept for us to understand, and no less in our present day. You know, the world in which we live is not governed from London. That's a bit of a joke, isn't it? Or from Washington, or from Brussels, or from Beijing, or from Moscow, or whatever. It is the Lord our God, our Father in heaven, who is sovereign over all the nations, even today. That's why we, as followers of Jesus, have no need to fear, because we know that whatever happens, the best is always yet to come, because he is the one in control. Well, moving on here, the verses 6 to 22 make it clear that the day of the Lord was near. Wail, he says, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty, it will come. There's mention of the Medes in verse 17, and they don't really become a thing until after the time of the prophet Isaiah. And then we have a rather splendid passage there. Did I put it on the screen? I can't remember if I did. No, I didn't. So in verse 10, the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light, for the sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. This is a form of apocalyptic language, speaking of judgment upon the world of Babylon. It's the language of judgment. We see similar language elsewhere in the prophets and even in the Gospels too. Well, moving on, following a short section speaking of future release from captivity in Babylon, there at the beginning of chapter 14, during which other nations would join themselves to Israel, a little similar to some things that we read at the beginning of chapter 2, you may recall. The prophet records this taunt against the king of Babylon. And the picture is one of the joy of those who have suffered under the oppression of Babylon. For now, everyone is happy because Babylon has gone under. And all of this, Isaiah tells us in verse 5, all of this is the work of Yahweh. God is in control. There's another little section. I'm not going to read it. I'll just put it up on the screen there, which begins, "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, how you're cut down to the ground." And these verses here from chapter 14 of the book of the prophet Isaiah are very often taken out of their context to speak of the origins of the devil. Maybe you've heard them used in that way. Maybe you've even used them that way yourself. Well, we need to read the text in its context. And here the text is speaking of the kingdom of Babylon, represented by their king, who, it might well be argued, well represented the devil himself. Fair enough. But it's speaking of the king of Babylon and of his downfall. The destruction of the kingdom of Babylon is seen as being complete. God is in control. Have we said that before? Yeah, I think we might even say it again at some point. So that section there, remarkable as the prophet looks ahead, even looks ahead at the joy of the downfall of the kingdom of Babylon long before they had even become a power to be reckoned with. Well, our next and final section for this evening that we'll look at in maybe just a little over a minute um, it addresses the other oracles against the nations. We've got Assyria there, where God says that I will break Assyria, the Assyrian, in my land and on my mountains, trample him underfoot. And I wonder if he's not there specifically referring to an event that the prophet will mention later in the book. So stay tuned for that. Then there's this oracle against Philistia. These are the Philistines. Um, this is dated to the year that King Ahaz died in 715 BC. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. He's probably speaking there of the death of Ahaz. Philistia shouldn't find any happiness in that because he would be succeeded by Hezekiah, and Hezekiah will defeat the Philistines, giving them no grounds for rejoicing. Oh, we could look at so many other bits and bobs, couldn't we? There's Moab and there's Syria. And oh, I'll mention this here in this little section against Philistia. Rejoice not, he says, therefore, from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. That word flying, or that phrase, flying, fiery serpent, is literally a flying seraph. But a seraph is literally a fiery one. So here is a flying, fiery one, a flying, fiery serpent. And that Philistia would be destroyed by famine. Well, there's Moab, there's Syria and Israel, Ethiopia, Egypt, and others, Babylon, Edom, Arabia. And then we come to a section in chapter 22 against Judah. Well, as to why we should come across a prophecy against Judah amidst those against nations foreign to Judah, I mean, we can't be certain, especially as this isn't the last. Maybe we should be surprised if we didn't come across an oracle, a prophecy against Judah. Well, this is probably dealing with the invasion of Judah by Assyria in 701. The second half of the chapter, and we're going to close on this note ever so briefly. The second half of this chapter concerns two individuals, the first of whom is a fella called Shebna. And I want to mention him simply because, as we mentioned the British Museum earlier, there is in the British Museum this artifact here. You'll find it high up on the wall in the Levant galleries. And this is the lintel from a rock-cut tomb, and it bears the name of a royal steward, which is exactly the role that was occupied by this chap Shebna. And he was described as being the shame of his master's house, for he had built for himself, he was a foreigner incidentally, and he had built for himself a rock-cut tomb. And in 1870, this lintel from a rock-cut tomb was discovered, bearing the same job description as was held by this chap Shebna. And even though much of the name is missing, I think I'm currently about 97.2% certain that this is the lintel from the tomb of which the prophet Isaiah speaks in chapter 22 of his book. So if you find yourself in London in the museum, then make sure you don't miss that. Some of you I know have already seen it. Well, that's all that we have time for this week. Thank you for being with us. Next week, we're going to look at a shorter section on which I've entitled Desolation, Delivery, and Triumph. But until then, well, you know how it goes. Same time, same place next week. May God bless you and keep you. Thank you for being with us.